24 hours after entering this strait, which received the name of Le Maire, the ship emerged from it, and to an archipelago of small islands situated to starboard was given the name of Barneveld, in honor of the Grand Pensionary of Holland. In 58 degrees, Le Maire doubled Cape Horn, so named in remembrance of the town where the expedition had been fitted out, and entered the South Sea. Le Maire afterwards went northwards as far as the parallel of the Juan Fernandez Islands, where he judged it wise to stop, in order to recruit his men who were suffering from scurvy. As Magellan had done, Le Maire and Schouten passed without perceiving them amongst the principal Polynesian archipelagos, and cast anchor on the 10th April at the Island of Dogs, where it was only possible to procure a little fresh water and some herbs. They hoped to reach the Solomon Islands, but in the north the dangerous archipelago was entered, in which were discovered Waterland Island, so named on account of its containing a great lake, and Fly Island, because a cloud of these insects settled upon the vessel, and it was impossible to get rid of them until at the end of 4 days there was a change of wind. Afterwards Le Maire crossed the Friendly Archipelago, and entered that of the Navigators, or of Samoa, of which 4 small islands still retain the names which were then given to them: Goat Hope, Cocoa, Horn, and Traitors Islands. The inhabitants of these parts showed themselves extremely addicted to stealing. They tried to draw out the bolts from the ship, and to break the chains. Scurvy continued to prevail among the crew, and it was therefore a great boon to receive from the king a present of a black boar and some fruits. The sovereign, who was named Latu, speedily arrived in a large canoe with sails, in shape like the Dutch sledges, trainox, escorted by a flotilla of 25 boats. The king did not venture himself to go on board the Concorde, but his son was of a bolder spirit, and inquired the reason of everything he saw with the most lively curiosity. The next day the number of canoes was greatly augmented, and the Dutch perceived by certain indications that an attack was impending. Accordingly, a shower of stones falls on a sudden upon the ship. The canoes approach nearer, become annoying, and the Dutch, to free themselves from them, are forced to resort to a discharge of musketry. This island was rightly named Traitors Island. It was now the 18th of May, and Le Maire ordered the course to be changed, that the Moluccas might be reached by the north of New Guinea. He probably passed within sight of the Solomon Archipelago, the Admiralty Islands, and the Thousand Islands, Mill Isles, coasting afterwards along New Guinea fro degrees to Gilwink Bay. He frequently landed and gave names to a number of points: the 25 islands which form a part of the Admiralty Archipelago, the High Corner, the high mountain Hoogburg, which seems to correspond to a portion of the neighboring coast of Corneliskyners Bay, Moa and Aramoa, 2 islands again seen later on by Tasman, the island to which was given the name of Schouten, but which is now called Mysore, and which must not be confounded with some other Schouten Islands situated upon the coast of Guinea, but much farther to the west, and finally the Cape Goat Hope, which appears to be Cape Saavedra at the western extremity of Mysore. After sighting the country of Papua, Schouten and Le Maire reached Gilolo, one of the Moluccas, where they received an eager welcome from their compatriots. When they were thoroughly rested from their fatigues and cured of scurvy, the Dutch went to Batavia, arriving there on the 23rd October, 1616, only 13 months after quitting the Texel, and having lost only 13 men during the long voyage. But the Company of the Indies did not at all understand their privileges being infringed upon, and a possibility discovered of reaching the colonies by a way not foreseen in the letters patent, which had been granted to the company at the time of its establishment. The governor caused the Concorde to be seized, and arrested her officers and sailors, whom he sent off to Holland, there to be tried. Poor Le Maire, who had expected a totally different recompense for his toils and fatigues, and for the discoveries which he had made, could not bear up under the blow which had fallen so unexpectedly upon him. He fell ill of grief and died in the latitude of the island of Mauritius. As for Schouten, he appears not to have been molested upon his return to his own country, and to have made several voyages to the Indies, which were not distinguished by any fresh discovery. He was returning to Europe in 1625, when he was forced by bad weather to enter Antongil Bay, upon the east coast of Madagascar, where he died. Such was the history of this important expedition, which by means of Strait Le Maire opened up a shorter and less dangerous route than that by Magellan's Strait, an expedition signalized by several discoveries in Oceania and by a more attentive exploration of points already seen by Spanish or Portuguese navigators. But it is often a matter of difficulty to settle with accuracy to which of these nations the discovery of certain islands, countries, or archipelagos in the neighborhood of Australia may be due. Since we are speaking of the Dutch, we shall put the chronological order of discoveries a little on one side, that we may relate, as well as those of Mendana and Quiros, the expeditions of Jan Abel Tasman. What was the early history of Tasman? By what concurrence of circumstances did he embrace the profession of a sailor? By what means did he acquire the nautical skill and science of which he gave so many proofs, and which conducted him to his important discoveries? From ignorance we cannot answer these questions. All we know of his biography commences with his departure from Batavia on 2nd June, 1639. After passing the Philippines, he would seem during this first voyage to have visited in company with Matthew Quast the Bonin Islands, then known by the fantastic title of the Gold and Silver Islands. In a second expedition, composed of 2 vessels of which he had the chief command, and which sailed from Batavia on the 14th of August, 1642, he reached the Mauritius on the 5th September, and afterwards sailed to the southeast, seeking for the Australian continent. On the 24th November, in latitude 42 degrees 25 south, he discovered land, to which he gave the name of Van Diemen, after the governor of the Sunda Islands, but which is now with much greater justice called Tasmania. He anchored there in Frederick Hendrick Bay and ascertained that the country was inhabited, although he could not see a single native. After following this coast for a certain time, he sailed eastwards, with the intention of afterwards making once more for the north, to reach the Solomon Archipelago. On the 13th December, in latitude 42 degrees 10, he came in sight of a mountainous country which he followed towards the north, until the 18th December, when he cast anchor in a bay. But even the boldest of the savages whom he met with there did not approach the ship within a stone's throw. Their voices were rough, their stature tall, their color brown inclining to yellow, and their black hair, which was nearly as long as that of the Japanese, was worn drawn up to the crown of the head. On the morrow, they summoned courage to go on board one of the vessels and carry on traffic by means of barter. Tasman, upon seeing these pacific dispositions, dispatched a boat for the purpose of obtaining a more accurate knowledge of the shore. Of the sailors who manned it, 3 were killed without provocation by the natives, while the others escaped by swimming and were picked up by the ship's boats. But by the time they were in readiness to fire upon the assailants, these had disappeared. The spot where this sad event happened received the name of Assassins' Mordinar's Bay. Tasman, who felt convinced that he could not carry on any intercourse with such fierce people, weighed anchor and sailed up the coast as far as its extreme point, which he named Cape Maria Van Diemen in honor of his lady, for a legend states that having had the audacity to pretend to the hand of the daughter of the governor of the East Indies, the latter had sent him to sea with 2 dilapidated ships, the Heemskirk and the Zeechen. 3 were killed by the natives without provocation. 3 were killed by the natives without provocation. The land thus discovered received the name of Staten Land, soon changed into that of New Zealand. On the 21st January, 1643, Tasman discovered the islands of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, upon which he found a great quantity of pigs, fowls, and fruit. On the 6th February, the ships entered an archipelago, consisting of a score of islands, which were called Prince William Islands, and after sighting Anthong Java, Tasman followed the coast of New Guinea from Cape Santa Maria, passed by the various points previously discovered by Le Maire and Schouten, and anchored off Batavia on the 15th June following, after a 10-months voyage. In a second expedition, Tasman, in obedience to his orders date, was to visit Van Diemen's Land, and to make a careful examination of the western coast of New Guinea, as far as 17 degrees south latitude, in order to ascertain whether that island belonged to the Australian continent. It does not appear that Tasman carried out this program, but the loss of his journals causes complete uncertainty as to the route which he followed and the discoveries which he may have made. From this time, there is no record of the events which marked the close of his career, nor of the place and date of his death. From the period of the taking of Malacca by Albuquerque, the Portuguese conceived that a new world extended to the south of Asia. Their ideas were soon shared by the Spaniards, and henceforward a series of voyages were made on the Pacific Ocean to search for a southern continent, of which the existence appeared geographically necessary to counterbalance the immense extent of the lands already known. Java the Great, designated later by the names of New Holland and Australia, had been seen by the French perhaps, or as is more probable by Saavedra, Fro to 1540, and it was sought for by a crowd of navigators, amongst whom we may mention the Portuguese, Serrao and Menezes, and the Spaniards, Saavedra, Hernando de Grijalva, Alvarado, and Inigo Ortiz de Redes, who explored the greater part of the islands to the north of New Guinea, as well as that great island itself. Afterwards come Mendana, Torres, and Quiros, upon whose deeds we shall pause a little, on account of the importance and authenticity of the discoveries which we owe to them. Alvaro Mendana de Neira was nephew to the governor of Lima, Don Pedro de Castro, who warmly advocated with the home government his nephew's project of searching for new countries in the Pacific Ocean. Mendana was 21 when he took the command of 2 ships and 125 soldiers and sailors. He sailed from Callao, the port of Lima, on the 19th November, 1567. After sighting the small island of Jesus, he discovered on the 7th February between 7 degrees and degrees south latitude the island of Santa Isabella, where the Spaniards built a brigantine, with which they explored the archipelago of which this island was a part. The inhabitants, says the narrative of a companion of Mendana, are anthropophagi. They devour those whom they can make their prisoners in war, and even without being in open hostility, those whom they can succeed in taking by treachery. One of the chiefs in the island sent to Mendana as a delicacy a quarter of a child, but the Spanish commander caused it to be buried in the presence of the natives, who appeared much hurt by an act which they could not understand. The Spaniards explored the island Las Palmas, Palm Island, Los Ramos, so named because it was discovered on Palm Sunday, Galley Island, and Buena Vista, of which the inhabitants, under the appearance of friendship, concealed hostile intentions, which were not long in displaying themselves. The same reception awaited the Spaniards at the island San Dimas, at Cesarga, and at Guadalcanal, upon which ginger was found for the first time. In the return voyage to Santa Isabella, the Spaniards pursued a course which enabled them to discover St. George Island, where they found bats as large as kites. Scarcely had the crew of the brigantine cast anchor in the harbor of Santa Isabella than they were obliged again to weigh it, for the place was so unhealthy that 5 soldiers died and a great number of others were taken ill. Mendana stopped at the island of Guadalcanal, where out of 10 men who had landed to fetch water, 1 Negro alone escaped from the attacks of the natives, who were extremely angry at one of their fellows having been carried off by the Spaniards. The punishment was terrible. 20 men were killed and a number of houses burnt. Mendana afterwards visited several islands of the Solomon archipelago, amongst others the 3 Marys and San Juan. Upon the latter island, whilst the ships were being repaired and calked, several affrays with the natives occurred, in which some prisoners were made. After this checkered rest, Mendana again put to sea and visited the islands of San Cristobal, Santa Catalina, and Santa Ana. But as by this time the number of invalids was considerable, the provisions and ammunition nearly exhausted, and the rigging become rotten, the flotilla now set out to return to Peru. The separation of the flagship, the discovery of certain islands which it is difficult to identify, and probably of the Sandwich Islands, violent storms, during which the sails were carried away, the sickness caused by the insufficiency and putrefaction of the water and biscuit on board, were all incidents signalizing this long and trying return voyage, which was ended by the arrival of the ships at the port of Colima in California after 5 months of navigation. The narrative of Mendana excited no enthusiasm, in spite of the name of Solomon which he gave to the archipelago discovered by him, to make it believed that from thence came the treasures of the Jewish king. marvelous recitals had no longer any fascination for men glutted with the riches of Peru. Proofs were what they demanded. The smallest nugget of gold or the least grain of silver would have been more satisfactory to them. Mendana had 27 years to wait before he was able to organize another expedition, but then his fleet was a large one, it being proposed to found a colony in the island of San Cristobal, which Alvaro de Mendana had seen during his first voyage. Thus 4 ships carrying nearly 400 people sailed from the port of Lima on the 11th April, 1595. Amongst those on board may be named Dona Isabella, wife of Mendana, the 3 brothers-in-law of the general, and the pilot Pedro Fernandez Quiros, who later on distinguished himself as commander-in-chief of another expedition. The fleet did not finally leave the Peruvian coast, where its equipment had been completed, until the 16th April. At the end of a month's navigation, not distinguished by any remarkable incident, an island was discovered, which according to custom received the name of the saint whose day it was, and was called Magdalena. Immediately the fleet was surrounded by a crowd of canoes bearing more than 400 Indians, of fine stature and nearly white, and who, while presenting coconuts and other fruits to the sailors, appeared to entreat them to disembark. The natives no sooner came on board than they began to pilfer, and it was necessary to fire a cannon to get rid of them. A wound which one of the natives received in the fray soon changed their disposition, and a discharge of musketry was the reply to the shower of arrows which they let fly from their boats. Not far from this island 3 others were discovered, San Pedro, Dominica, and Santa Cristina, and the name of Las Marquesas de Mendoza was given to the group, in honor of the governor of Peru. So friendly had been the intercourse at the beginning, that an Indian woman, upon seeing the beautiful fair hair of Dona Isabella de Mendana, had begged her by signs to give her a curl of it. But by the fault of the Spaniards, the mutual relations speedily became hostile, and so continued until the day when the natives, becoming conscious of the great inferiority of their arms, begged for peace. On the 5th August, the Spanish flotilla again put to sea and made 1,200 miles west-northwest. On the 20th August were discovered the St. Bernard, since called Dangerous Islands, and afterwards Queen Charlotte's Islands, upon which, notwithstanding the scarcity of provisions, no landing was made. After Solitary Island, a name which explains its situation, the Santa Cruz archipelago was reached. But at this time, during a storm, the flagship became separated from the fleet, and although search was made several times, no tidings of her were obtained. 50 canoes, carrying a crowd of natives of a tawny complexion or of a lustrous black, immediately approached the ships. All had frizzled hair, black, red, or some other color, for it was dyed. Their teeth also were dyed red. The head was half-shaven. The body was naked, except a small veil of fine linen, the face and the arms painted black, glittering and striped with various colors. The neck and limbs loaded with several strings of small beads of gold or of black wood, of fish's teeth, or of a species of metals made of mother of pearl. Of pearls. For arms they carried bows, poisoned arrows with sharp points hardened in the fire, or tipped with bone and steeped in the juice of a herb, great stones, heavy wooden swords made of stiff wood, with 3 harpoon points, each more than a handbreadth long. Slung over their shoulders, they had haversacks exceedingly well made out of palm leaves, and filled with biscuits made from certain roots, which served them for food. Dona Isabella consults the officers. Dona Isabella consults the officers. At first Mendana thought he recognized in these natives the inhabitants of the islands he was seeking, but he was quickly undeceived. The vessels were received with a shower of arrows, which was the more vexatious because Mendana, seeing that he could not find the Solomon Islands, had determined to establish his colony in this archipelago. At this juncture, discord reigned among the Spaniards. A revolt fomented against the general was almost immediately suppressed, and the guilty were executed. But these sorrowful events, and the fatigues of the voyage, had so completely undermined the health of the head of the expedition that he died on the 17th October, after having had time to indicate his wife as his successor in the conduct of the enterprise. After the death of Mendana, the hostilities with the natives redoubled, and many of the Spaniards were so exhausted by sickness and hardships that a score of thoroughly determined natives might easily have gained the mastery over them. To persist in the intention of founding a settlement under such conditions would have been folly. All agreed in this, and the anchor was raised on the 18th November. Dona Isabella de Mendana's project was to go to Manila, and there to obtain recruits from amongst the colonists, with whom she would return to found a settlement. She consulted the officers, who all gave their approval in writing, and she found in Quiros a devotion and skill which were speedily to be put to a severe proof. They at once steered away from New Guinea in order to avoid being entangled amongst the numerous archipelagos surrounding it, and also to enable them sooner to reach the Philippines, which the dilapidated state of the ships rendered necessary. After passing within sight of several islands surrounded by reefs of madrepore, upon which the crews wished to land, a permission which Quiros with great prudence always refused, after having been separated from one of the ships of the squadron, which could not or would not follow, the flotilla arrived at the Ladrone, soon to be called the Marian Islands. The Spaniards went on shore several times to buy some provisions. The natives did not desire either their silver or gold, but set the highest value upon iron and all tools made of that metal. The narrative contains here some details upon the veneration shown by the natives towards their ancestors, which are curious enough to warrant our reproducing them verbatim. They take out the bones from the bodies of their relations, burn the flesh, and mixing the ashes with tuba, a wine made from the cocoa palm, swallow them. They weep for the dead every year for a whole week. There are a great number of female mourners who are to be hired for the purpose. Besides that, all the neighbors come to weep in the house of the deceased, the compliment being returned to them when the turn comes for the feast to take place at their house. These anniversaries are much frequented, all those assisting at them being liberally regaled. They weep all day and drink to intoxication all night. They recite in the midst of tears the life and deeds of the dead, beginning with the moment of his birth, and dealing with the whole course of his life, recounting his strength, his height, his beauty, in a word, all that can in any way do him honor. If some amusing action occur in the recital, the company begin to laugh as if they would split their sides. Then on a sudden they drink and are again drowned in tears. There are sometimes 200 persons present at these absurd anniversaries. When the Spanish crew arrived at the Philippines, it was scarcely more than a company of skeletons, emaciated and half dead with hunger. Dona Isabella landed at Manila on the 11th February, 1596, under a salute from the guns, and was solemnly received in the midst of the troops drawn up under arms. The rest of the crew, 50 having died since the departure from Santa Cruz, were housed and fed at the public expense, and the women all found husbands in Manila, except 4 or 5 who embraced the religious life. As for Dona Isabella, she was escorted back to Peru some time afterwards by Quiros, who lost no time in submitting to the viceroy a project for a fresh voyage. But Luis de Velasco, who had succeeded Mendoza, referred the navigator to the King of Spain and the Council of the Indies, under the pretext that such a decision would overstep the limits of his authority. Quiros therefore went to Spain and thence to Rome, where he received a kindly welcome from the Pope, who recommended him warmly to Philip Roman III. At length in 1605, after numberless applications and solicitations, he was empowered to fit out at Lima the 2 vessels which he should judge the most suitable for the investigation of the Australian continent, and for continuing the discoveries of Mendana. With 2 ships and 1 light vessel, Quiros set out from Callao on the 21st December, 1605. At 3,000 miles from Peru, he had as yet discovered no land. In latitude 25 degrees south, he observed a group of small islands belonging to the dangerous archipelago. These were the Conversion de San Pablo, the Osnabrück of Wallis, and Decina, so named because it was the 10th island seen. Although this island was defended by rocks, intercourse was carried on with the natives, whose dwellings were scattered about amongst palm trees on the seashore. The natives were strong and well-proportioned, and their chief wore on his head a kind of crown made of small black feathers so fine and supple that they might have been taken for silk. His fair hair, which descended to the waist, excited the wonder of the Spaniards, who, not being able to understand how a man with so tawny-colored a face could have such light yellow hair, chose to think that he was married and that he wore his wife's hair. This singular color was only due to the habitual use of powdered lime, which burns the hair and causes it to turn yellow. This island, to which Quiros gave the name of Sagittaria, is, according to Fleurieu, Tahiti, one of the principal of the group of Society Islands. On the succeeding days, Quiros sighted several other islands, upon which he did not land, and to which he gave names taken from the calendar, according to a practice which has changed all the native nomenclature of Oceania into a veritable litany. One island visited may be especially noticed. It was named the island of La Gente Hermosa on account of the beauty of its inhabitants and of the fair color and coquetry of its women, who, as the Spaniards declared, even bore away the palm for grace and attractiveness from their own fellow countrywomen of Lima, whose beauty is proverbial. This island, according to Quiros, was situated upon the same parallel as Santa Cruz, to which he intended to go. He therefore sailed westward and reached an island called by the natives Tomaco in 10 degrees south latitude and miles east of Santa Cruz. This must have been one of the Duff Islands, and here Quiros was told that if he directed his course southwards, he would discover a great land, of which the inhabitants were whiter than those whom he had hitherto seen. This information determined him to abandon his scheme of going to Santa Cruz. He steered in a southwesterly direction, and after having sighted several small islands, he arrived on the 1st May, 1606, in a bay more than 24 miles broad. He gave to this island the name which it still bears of Espiritu Santo. It was one of the New Hebrides group. What events happened during the stay of the ships here? The narrative is silent upon this subject, but we know from other sources that the crew mutinied, made Quiros prisoner, and abandoning the second ship and the brigantine, set out on the 11th June to return to America, where they arrived on the 3rd October, 1606. After 9 months' voyage, M. Ed. Charton throws no light upon this incident. He is silent upon the mutiny of the crew, and even throws all the blame of the separation upon the commander of the second vessel, Louis Vies de Tours, who abandoned his chief in quitting Espiritu Santo. Now it is known by a letter from Tours himself to the King of Spain, published by Lord Stanley at the end of his English edition of Anton de Morga's History of the Philippines, that he remained 15 days waiting for Quiros in the Bay of St. Philip and St. James. The officers met in council, resolved to weigh anchor on the 26th June and to continue the search for the Australian continent. Hindered by bad weather, which prevents him from sailing round Espiritu Santo Island, assailed by the demands of a crew over whom prevails a slight breath of mutiny, Tours decides to steer to the northeast to reach the Spanish islands. In 11 degrees 30, he discovers land, which he imagines must be the commencement of New Guinea. All this land is part of New Guinea, says Tours. It is peopled by Indians who are not very white, and who go naked, although their middles are covered with the bark of trees. They fight with javelins, bucklers, and certain clubs of stone, the whole adorned with beautiful feathers. All along this land there are other inhabited islands. Upon the whole of this coast there are numerous and vast harbors, with very broad rivers and great plains. Outside these islands stretch reefs and shallows. The islands are between these dangers and the mainland, and a channel runs between. We took possession of these harbors in your Majesty's name. Having pursued this coast for 900 miles and seen our latitude decrease fro 2 degrees until we found ourselves in 9 degrees, at this point commenced a shoal of from 3 to 9 fathoms deep, which stretched along the coast to 71.2 degrees. Not being able to proceed farther on account of the numerous shallows and powerful currents which we encountered, we decided to alter our course to the southwest, by the deep channel which has been mentioned, as far as about 11 degrees. There is there, from one end to the other, an archipelago of innumerable islands, by which I passed. At the end of the 11th degree the bottom became deeper. There were some very large islands there, and there appeared to be more of them towards the south. They were inhabited by a black population, very robust and quite naked, bearing for arms strong and long spears, arrows, and stone clubs roughly fashioned. Modern geographers are agreed in recognizing in the localities thus described that portion of the Australian coast which ends in York Peninsula and the extremity of New Guinea recently visited by Captain Moresby. It was known that Tours had entered the strait which has been named after him, and which divides New Guinea from Cape York, but the very recent exploration of the southeastern portion of New Guinea, of which the population has been discovered to be of a comparatively light color and, differing much from the Papus, has just furnished an unexpected confirmation of the discoveries of Quiros. It is for this reason that we have dwelt at some length upon them, referring for the purpose to a very learned work of M.E.T. Hamey, which appeared in the Bulletin de la Société de Géographie. It behoves us now to say a few words about some travelers who explored some unfrequented countries and furnished their contemporaries with more exact knowledge of a world until then almost unknown. The first of these travelers is Francois Pirard of Laval. Having embarked in 1601 on board a St. Malo ship to go to the Indies to trade, he was wrecked in the Maldive archipelago. These islets or atolls, detached coral reefs, to the number of at least 12,000, descend into the Indian Ocean from Cape Comorin as far as the equator. The worthy Pirard relates his shipwreck, the flight of a portion of his companions in captivity in the archipelago, and his long sojourn of 7 years upon the Maldive Islands, a stay rendered almost agreeable by the pains which he took to acquire the native language. He had plenty of time to learn the manners, customs, religion, and industries of the inhabitants, as well as to study the productions and climate of the country. Thus his narrative is filled with details of all kinds, and had retained its attractions until recent years, because travelers do not voluntarily frequent this unhealthy archipelago, the isolated situation which had kept away foreigners and conquerors. Pirard's narrative, therefore, is still instructive and agreeable reading. In 1607, a fleet was sent to the Maldives by the King of Bengal in order to carry off the 100 or 120 cannon which the Maldives sovereign owed to the wreck of numerous Portuguese vessels. Pirard, notwithstanding all the liberty allowed him, and that he had become a landholder, was desirous to behold his beloved Brittany once more. He therefore eagerly embraced this opportunity of quitting the archipelago with the 3 companions who out of the whole crew alone remained with him. But the eventful travels of Pirard were not yet concluded. Taken first to Ceylon, he was carried afterwards to Bengal and endeavored to reach Cochin. Before reaching this town, he was captured by the Portuguese and carried prisoner to Cochin. He afterwards fell ill and was nursed in the hospital of Goa, which he only quitted to serve for 2 years as a soldier, at the end of which time he was again thrown into prison, and it was not that he was able to revisit the good town of Laval. After so many trials, Pirard must doubtless have felt the need of repose, and we are justified in imagining, from the silence of history as to the close of his life, that he was privileged at length to find happiness. While the honest Burgess Francois Pirard was, so to speak, in spite of himself, and from having indulged the desire of making a fortune too rapidly, launched into adventures in which he had to pass much of his life, circumstances of a different and romantic kind caused Pietro della Valle to determine upon traveling. Descendant of an ancient and noble family, he is by turns a soldier of the Pope and a sailor chasing Barbary corsairs. Upon his return to Rome, he finds that a rival, profiting by his absence, has taken his place with a young girl whom he was to have married. So great a misfortune demands an heroic remedy, and Della Valle makes a vow of pilgrimage to the Holy Sepulchre. But if, as saith the proverb, there is no road which does not lead to Rome, so there is no circuit so long as not to lead to Jerusalem, and of this Della Valle was to make proof. He embarks at Venice in 1614, passes 13 months at Constantinople, reaches Alexandria by sea, afterwards Cairo, and joins a caravan which at length brings him to Jerusalem. But while en route, Della Valle had no doubt imbibed a taste for a traveler's life, for he visits in succession Baghdad, Damascus, Aleppo, and even pushes on as far as the ruins of Babylon. We must believe that Della Valle was marked out as an easy prey to love, for upon his return he becomes enamored of a young Christian woman of Mardin, of wondrous beauty, whom he marries. One would imagine that here at length is fixed the destiny of this indefatigable traveler. Nothing of the kind. Della Valle contrives to accompany the Shah in his war against the Turks, and to traverse, during 4 consecutive years, the provinces of Iran. He quits Ispahan in 1621, loses his wife in the month of December of the same year, causes her to be embalmed, and has her coffin carried about in his train for 4 years longer, which he devotes to exploring Ormuz, the western coasts of India, the Persian Gulf, Aleppo, and Syria, landing at length at Naples in 1626. The countries which this singular character visited, urged on as he was by an extraordinary enthusiasm, are described by him in a shrewd, gay, and natural style, and even with some degree of fidelity. But he inaugurates the pleiad of amateur, curious, and commercial travelers. He is the first of that prolific race of tourists who each year encumber geographical literature with numerous volumes, from which the savant finds nothing to glean beyond meager details. Tavernier is a specimen of insatiable curiosity. At 22 he has traversed France, England, the Low Countries, Germany, Switzerland, Poland, Hungary, and Italy. Then, when Europe no longer offers any food for his curiosity, he starts for Constantinople, where he remains for a year, and then arrives in Persia, where the opportunity ends. Quelques diable aussi le passant. He sets to work to purchase carpets, stuffs, precious stones, and those thousand trifles of which lovers of curiosities soon became passionately fond, and for which they were ready to pay fabulous sums. The profit which Tavernier realized from his cargo induced him to resume his travels. But like a wise and prudent man, before starting he learnt from a jeweler the art of knowing precious stones. During 4 successive journeys to 1663, he traveled over Persia, the Mughal Empire, the Indies as far as the frontier of China, and the islands of Sunda. Dazzled by the immense fortune which his traffic had obtained for him, Tavernier would play the lord, and soon saw himself on the verge of ruin, which he hoped to avert by sending one of his nephews to the East with a considerable venture. But instead, his ruin was consummated by this young man, who, judging it best to appropriate the goods which had been confided to him, settled down at Ispahan. Tavernier, who was a well-educated man, made a number of interesting observations upon the history, manners, and customs of the countries which he visited. His narrative certainly contributed to give his contemporaries a much more correct idea of the countries of the East than they previously possessed. All travelers during the reign of Louis Roman XIV take the route to the East Indies, whatever may be the end they have in view. Africa is entirely deserted, and if America be the theater of any real exploration, it is carried out without aid from government. Whilst Tavernier was accomplishing his last and distant excursions, a distinguished archaeologist, Jean de the Venot, nephew of Melchizedek the Venot, a learned man to whom we owe an interesting series of travels, journeyed through Europe and visited Malta, Constantinople, Egypt, Tunis, and Italy. He brought back in 1661 an important collection of medals and monumental inscriptions, recognized nowadays as so important a help to the historian and the philologist. In 1664, he set out anew for the Levant and visited Persia, Bassora, Surat, and India, where he saw Masulipatam, Barhimpur, Aurangabad, and Golconda. But the fatigues which he had experienced prevented his return to Europe, and he died in Armenia in 1667. The success of his narratives was considerable, and was well deserved by the care and exactitude of a traveler whose scientific attainments in history, geography, and mathematics far surpassed the average level of his contemporaries. We must now speak of the amiable Bernier, the pretty philosopher, as he was entitled in his polite circle, in which were found Ninon and La Fontaine, Madame de la Sablière, Saint Evremont, and Chapelle, without reckoning many other good and gay spirits, refractories from the stiff solemnity which then weighed upon the entourage of Louis Roman XIV. Bernier could not escape from the fashion of traveling. After having taken a rapid survey of Syria and Egypt, he resided for 12 years in India, where his good knowledge of medicine conciliated the favor of Aurangzeb and gave him the opportunity of beholding in detail, and with profit, an empire then in the full bloom of its prosperity. To the south of Hindustan, Ceylon had more than one surprise in reserve for its explorers. Robert Knox, taken prisoner by the natives, owed to this sad circumstance his long residence in the country and the collection of the first authentic documents relating to the forests and the savage natives of Ceylon. The Dutch, with a commercial jealousy which they were not singular in evincing, having until now kept secret all the information which had come to light concerning an island of which they were endeavoring to make a colony. Jean Chardin. Jean Chardin. From an old print. Another merchant, Jean Chardin, the son of a rich Parisian jeweler, jealous of the successes of Tavernier, desired, like him, to make his fortune by trading in diamonds. The countries which attract these merchants are those of which the fame for wealth and prosperity is become proverbial. These are Persia and India, where rich costumes sparkle with jewels and gold, and where there are mines of diamonds of a fabulous size. The moment is well chosen for visiting these countries. Thanks to the Mughal emperors, civilization and art have been developed. Mosques, palaces, temples have been built, and towns have risen suddenly. Their taste, that curious taste, so distinctly characterized, so different from our own, is displayed in the construction of gigantic edifices, quite as much as in jewelry and goldsmiths' work, and in the manufacture of those costly trifles of which the East was beginning to be passionately fond. Like a wise man, Chardin takes a partner, as good a connoisseur as himself. At first Chardin only traversed Persia in order to reach Ormuz and to embark for the Indies. The following year he returns to Ispahan and applies himself to learn the language of the country in order to be able to transact business directly and without any intermediary agent. He has the good fortune to please the Shah, Abbas Roman II. From that time his fortune is made, for it is at once genteel and also the part of a prudent courtier to employ the same purveyor as his sovereign. But Chardin had another merit besides that of making a fortune. He was able to collect so considerable a mass of information concerning the government, manners, creeds, customs, towns, and populations of Persia, that his narrative has remained to our own days the vade-mecum of the traveler. This guide is so much the more precious because Chardin took care to engage at Constantinople a clever draftsman named Grelot, by whom were reproduced the monuments, cities, scenes, costumes, and ceremonies which so well portray what Chardin called the everyday of a people. When Chardin returned to France in 1670, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, with the barbarous persecutions which resulted from it, had chased from their country great numbers of artisans, who, taking refuge in foreign countries, enriched them with our arts and manufactures. Chardin, being a Protestant, clearly perceived that his religion would hinder him from attaining to what are termed honors and advancement. As, to use his own words, one is not free to believe what one will, he resolved to return to the Indies, where, without being urged to a change of religion, he could not fail of attaining an honorable position. Thus liberty of conscience was at that period greater in Persia than in France. Such an assertion on the part of a man who had made the comparison is but little flattering to the grandson of Henry Roman IV. This time, however, Chardin did not follow the same route as before. He passed by Smyrna and Constantinople, and from thence, crossing the Black Sea, he landed in the Crimea in the garb of a religious. Whilst passing through the region of the Caucasus, he had the opportunity of studying the Abkhazians and Circassians. He afterwards penetrated into Mingrelaya, where he was robbed of his goods and papers and of a portion of the jewels which he was taking back to Europe. He could not have escaped himself had it not been for the devotion to him of the Theatines, from whom he had received hospitality, but he escaped only to fall into the hands of the Turks, who in their turn accepted a ransom for him. After further misadventures, he arrived at Tiflis on the 17th of December, 1672, and as Georgia was then governed by a prince who was a tributary of the Shah of Persia, it was easy for Chardin to reach Erivan, Tauriz, and finally Ispahan. After a stay of 4 years in Persia and a concluding journey to India, during which he realized a considerable fortune, Chardin returned to Europe and settled in England, his own country on account of his religion being forbidden ground to him.